Chapter 11. And That Thou Art. During my third year in high school, I experienced an increasingly deep inner conflict. My awareness of God as the Creator, separate and distinct from the universe He had made, an awareness that had been a part of me even as a small boy, contradicted the concept given to me by Hinduism that God was everything, that the Creator and the creation were one and the same. I felt torn between these two irreconcilable views. What I experienced in meditation agreed with the Vedic teaching about Brahman, but my experience of life at other times disagreed. In yogic trance, I felt a oneness with the whole universe. I was no different from a bug or cow or distant star. We all partook of the same essence. Everything was Brahman, and Brahman was everything. And that thou art, said the Vedas, telling me that Brahman was my true self, the God within that I worshipped sitting in front of a mirror. It seemed difficult to face everyday life after hours in trance. The conflict and contrast between these two worlds was unresolvable. The higher states of consciousness I experienced in meditation were supposedly approaching reality as it really was. Yet the everyday world of joys and sore rouse, pain and pleasure, birth and death, fears and frustrations, of bitter conflicts with my Aunt Ravati and unanswerable questions posed by my classmates at Queen's Royal College, of holy men who stank and cursed, and of brahmacharyas who fell in love. This was the world I had to deal with, and I dared not dismiss it as illusion unless I was prepared to call insanity true enlightenment. My religion made beautiful theory, but I was having serious difficulty applying it in everyday life. Nor was it only a matter of my five senses versus my inner visions. It was a matter of reason also. The real conflict was between two opposing views of God. Was God all that there was, or could He make a rock or a man without its being part of Himself? If there was only one reality, then Brahman was evil as well as good, death as well as life, hatred as well as love. That made everything meaningless, life an absurdity. It was not easy to maintain both one's sanity and the view that good and evil, love and hate, life and death were one reality. Furthermore, if good and evil were the same, then all karma was the same and nothing mattered. So why be religious? It seemed unreasonable, but Goseen reminded me that reason could not be trusted. It was part of the illusion. If reason also was Maya, as the Vedas taught, then how could I trust any concept, including the idea that all was Maya and only Brahman was real? How could I be sure that the bliss I sought was not also an illusion if none of my perceptions or reasonings were to be trusted? To accept what my religion taught, I had to deny what reason told me. But what about other religions? If all was one, then they were all the same. That seemed to deify confusion as the ultimate reality. I was confused. My only hope was yoga, which Krishna in the Gita promised would dispel all ignorance through the realization that I was not other than God Himself. At times, this inner vision had dazzled and excited me. I had felt so close to self-realization that I could almost see myself as Brahman, the Lord of all. Almost, but not quite. I had told myself it was true and pretended that I was God, but always there had been that inner conflict, a voice warning of delusion. I had fought against this as the vestige of primordial ignorance, and at times had felt that I was on the verge of conquering this insidious illusion just as my father had. But never had I quite been able to bridge the chasm separating me and all of creation from the Creator. I began to think of the Creator as the true God, in contrast to the many Hindu gods, some of whom I was convinced I had met in my trances. I felt increasingly the stark difference between the terror they struck in my heart and the instinct I had that the true God was loving and kind. There was not one of the Hindu gods whom I now felt I could really trust, not one that loved me. I felt a growing hunger to know the Creator, but I knew no mantras to recite to Him, and I had the uneasy feeling that my pursuit of self-realization was not bringing me nearer to Him, but taking me farther from Him. It troubled me also that, in spite of my attempts to realize that I was Brahman, the feeling of peace I achieved in meditation never lasted very long in the everyday world, especially when I encountered Aunt Ravati. "Rabbi Maharaj, where have you been?" Aunt Ravati cried in the scolding, querulous tone she so often used in addressing me lately. "I asked you to sweep down the stairs." She was standing in the doorway of the kitchen as I walked past from the prayer room where I had just spent 2 hours in meditation. The blissful sense of inner peace I had enjoyed during that brief solitude was shattered by her voice. Even though such menial work was unthinkable for a Brahmin, I replied, "I'm going to do it. Don't shout at me. How else can I get your attention? You're always dreaming and in another world." "That's better than being in your world," I muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "Watch your mouth." "What about yours?" I retorted, this time under my breath. Sweeping the steps outside, I thought to myself, "Lord of the universe, Brahmin. Thou art." It seems so real when I'm meditating, but with a broom in my hand. "Hey, Rabbi, we're going to the beach after lunch. You want to come along?" My cousin Krishna, with whom I didn't get along very well either, he was so attached to his mother, was scrubbing the table and chairs on the patio, where I had fed the beggar several weeks before. Shouldering my broom, I walked idly toward him. "Maybe," I responded without enthusiasm, "if Her Royal Highness doesn't expect me to sweep off the roof too." "Look here! You better watch your mouth, yes!" Aunt Ravati had come down the steps to inspect my work and had walked up quietly behind me. "And two beside, you better go back and sweep over the steps. It still have black dust all over." "I can't hold back the wind from blowing back the dust," I replied angrily. A gentle breeze was carrying the ashes from the nearby sugar factory back onto the steps as fast as I swept it off. It wasn't my fault. Why couldn't she leave me alone? "You lazy thing!" she scolded. "You lazy just like your father!" Like my father? I let out an anguished cry that startled me. No one could talk about him that way. Years of smoldeering hatred erupted like a volcano inside me. I became conscious of a set of barbell weights Nana had used to exercise with, resting in their familiar place only a step away. Blind with rage, scarcely conscious of what I was doing, I stooped over. And when I straightened up, I had lifted the bar by one end as though it were a cricket bat. I swung the whole thing over my shoulder, taking aim for my aunt's head. As the weights arched up, from behind me, Krishna made a desperate lunge and grabbed the other end. As though a spell had been broken, my superhuman strength vanished, and the barbells fell with a sickening thud, smashing the thick concrete. It seemed an eternity that I stood there staring into my aunt's ashen face. Her mouth had frozen half open, framing a wordless cry. I was shaking like a leaf in the wind. My eyes darted to the weights sunk into the concrete, then to Krishna, standing stunned behind me, breathing heavily, fear showing in his eyes, then back to my aunt's stricken expression. The next thing I knew, I was running up the stairs, sobbing in loud gasps. Reaching my room, I slammed the door and locked it behind me. Falling across the bed, I lay there for what seemed like hours, crying softly, unable to believe what had happened. My world had come to an abrupt end. I could never face my aunt again, nor any other human being. Never. I believed in nonviolence and had preached it like a Gandhi to my young Hindu friends. I was the strictest of vegetarians because I would not take any life and carefully avoided stepping on an ant or a bug. Then how could I have lifted those weights like a club and swung them over my head as though they weighed nothing at all, intending to strike my aunt? After midnight, when everyone was asleep and I should have been on the veranda seeking bliss through yoga, I crept quietly from my room, through the kitchen, and down the stairs to the patio. Groping my way in the darkness along the wall, I found the weights, still lying where I had dropped them. There was something I had to be sure of. Stooping over, I grabbed the bar with both hands, this time in the middle, arched my back and pulled with all my strength. I could not budge those weights, not an inch. With a convulsive sob, I turned back toward the stairs. In my room again, I fell once more across the bed and wept quietly, face buried in my pillow. Where had the incredible strength come from to handle those heavy weights like a feather? Anger alone, even the wildest, could not account for that. Had I been possessed by one of the spirits I encountered in meditation? That whatever had lifted those weights was evil, I had no doubt. But I had been seeking union with Brahman. Wasn't he evil as well as good, death as well as life, since he was all? Had I proven that at last? Was this my true self? And that thou art, this evil being of great power that had momentarily shed its veneer of religion? No, I could not believe that. I was horrified by what had happened. But how could I be sure that this evil force would not suddenly possess me again, perhaps with more tragic consequences the next time? That question tortured me. Who were these gods and spirits and forces that I invited to come into me through Nyasa and yoga and meditation? Were they evil or good or both? Or was everything Maya and I insane to try to make sense out of it? For several days I remained in my room, refusing all efforts to coax me out for a meal or even for a drink, and when at last I did try to face the world again, that world of illusion that was supposed to be unreal but which gave me so much trouble, I could scarcely look it in the eye. I said little to anyone. Aunt Ravati and I avoided one another. There were no more orders directed at me about chores around the house. My morning visits to Ma were brief and strained. Eventually, however, as I had hoped, time seemed to veil even this horrible episode in my life with a dulling sense of distance. Aunt Ravati and I still avoided one another as much as possible, but when the occasion arose, I was able to look at her, to say whatever necessity demanded in a fairly please aunt tone, and she showed no continuing resentment, at least not outwardly. The most troubling effect that lingered on was a new difficulty in convincing myself that I was Brahman, a deep, unresolvable, uncertain Yastawar what Brahman and the many gods I worshipped really represented or were. And who was I? My goal of self-realization had suffered a serious setback.